There is something peculiar about the human condition that we rarely speak of openly, yet it haunts every corner of our existence. You have felt it, I am certain. That moment when everything is going well, when the stars seem aligned, when happiness sits within your grasp like a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked, and then something inside you whispers no. Something deep and primal reaches out and smashes that fruit before you can taste its sweetness. This is not mere coincidence. This is not bad luck or poor timing or the cruel hand of fate. This is sabotage, but not from any external enemy. The enemy lives within the house of your own psyche, and it has been there longer than you remember, longer than you have words to describe, feeding on the very joy you seek to cultivate. Tonight, we descend into the labyrinth of self-destruction, not as tourists seeking easy answers, but as explorers willing to face the darkness that dwells in the basement of our own souls. For what I am about to share with you is not comfortable psychology, not the kind that soothes with platitudes and promises of quick fixes. No, this is archaeology of the spirit, a careful excavation of the buried reasons why we become our own worst enemies precisely when we should be our greatest allies. You may have come here wondering why your relationships crumble just as they begin to flourish, why your career stalls when success beckons, why you find yourself pulling back from the very experiences that could transform your life. You may have noticed a pattern, a recurring theme in the story of your existence where joy becomes anxiety, where love becomes fear, where possibility becomes paralysis. If so, then you have glimpsed the shadow that walks beside every human being, the part of us that would rather remain safely miserable than risk the unknown territory of genuine fulfillment. But understand this: what we call self-sabotage is not a flaw in your character. It is not evidence of weakness or lack of willpower. It is an ancient survival mechanism, a psychological immune system that once served a purpose but now operates like a broken alarm, sounding warnings where no danger exists. To comprehend why we sabotage our own happiness, we must first understand that the psyche is not a single, unified entity. It is a parliament of voices, each with its own agenda, its own fears, its own desperate strategies for keeping you alive. There is the part of you that dreams and hopes and reaches toward the light. But there is also the part that remembers every wound, every betrayal, every moment when trust led to pain. This shadow guardian has been taking notes since childhood, cataloguing every instance where opening your heart resulted in heartbreak, where vulnerability led to exploitation, where hope ended in disappointment. And so it learns to intervene, to create obstacles, to engineer failures before life can deliver them organically. The tragedy is that this guardian cannot distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones. It sees happiness approaching and sounds the same. Alarms it would sound for approaching danger. It whispers that good things don't last, that you don't deserve joy, that something terrible will happen if you allow yourself to be truly content. And because these whispers come from within, because they speak in your own voice, using your own memories as evidence, you believe them. You mistake the voice of trauma for the voice of wisdom. Consider the woman who finds herself picking fights with her partner just as their relationship deepens into something beautiful. She does not consciously choose this behavior. She is not deliberately trying to destroy what she has built. But somewhere in the caverns of her unconscious, an ancient alarm is ringing. Love equals vulnerability. Vulnerability equals danger. Danger must be avoided at all costs. And so she creates distance through conflict. She builds walls through accusations. She sabotages the very connection her heart craves because her psyche has learned that connection leads to abandonment. Or witness the man who develops mysterious illnesses just before job interviews for positions he truly wants. His body rebels not against success itself, but against the exposure that success would bring. Success means visibility. Visibility means scrutiny. Scrutiny means the possibility of being found wanting. His unconscious would rather he remain safely invisible in mediocrity than risk the devastating possibility of being seen and rejected. The illness is not malingering. It is a psychosomatic protection racket, his nervous system's attempt to keep him safe from imagined annihilation. These are not isolated cases or rare psychological curiosities. These are the daily dramas of the human condition played out in millions of lives across the planet. We are all walking around with internal saboteurs, shadow selves that have appointed themselves as guardians of our limitations. They monitor our progress toward happiness with the vigilance of prison guards, ready to intervene the moment we approach the boundaries of their carefully constructed safety zones. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating, truly complex. The saboteur within is not evil, it is not malicious. It believes itself to be your protector, your most loyal defender against a world that has already proven itself capable of inflicting unbearable pain. It operates from a logic that made perfect sense at some point in your history, usually in childhood, when you were genuinely powerless and genuinely vulnerable to the whims of others. Perhaps you learned early that expressing joy led to it being taken away, that showing excitement made you a target for mockery or disappointment. Perhaps you discovered that being too happy made the adults around you uncomfortable, that your light somehow threatened their darkness. Or maybe you absorbed the unspoken family rule that good things don't happen to people like us, that hope is a luxury you cannot afford, that contentment is a dangerous illusion that leaves you unprepared for life's inevitable blows. The child who learns these lessons develops internal strategies for survival. They learn to dim their light, to expect less, to create their own disappointments before life can deliver them. They become experts at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, at finding clouds in every silver lining, at building escape routes from every garden of earthly delight. And this expertise follows them into adulthood, where it operates with the same urgency and conviction it possessed when they were 5 years old and genuinely dependent on others for their survival. The unconscious, you see, has no concept of time. It does not understand that you are no longer a child, that you now possess resources and capabilities that were unavailable to you decades ago. It continues to operate from the assumption that you are still that vulnerable being who needed protection from hope, from trust, from the dangerous delusion that life could be good. And so it continues its vigilant work, creating chaos where you seek peace, manufacturing problems where you attempt to build solutions, ensuring that you never venture too far from the familiar territory of struggle and limitation. This is why positive thinking alone cannot overcome self-sabotage. This is why affirmations and vision boards and mantras often feel hollow and ineffective. You cannot simply think your way past a part of yourself that believes it is fighting for your survival. You cannot reason with a shadow that speaks the language of pure instinct, of primal fear, of cellular memory that exists below the level of conscious thought. The saboteur operates through 1,000 subtle mechanisms. It speaks through the voice of practical caution that becomes paralyzing perfectionism. It manifests as the healthy skepticism that curdles into cynical despair. It appears as the reasonable consideration of risks that transforms into anticipatory anxiety about everything that could go wrong. It whispers that you are not ready, not worthy, not capable, not safe. It reminds you of every past failure as evidence of inevitable future failure. It presents itself as realism while dealing exclusively in the currency of fear, and perhaps most insidiously, it often disguises itself as virtue. The saboteur convinces you that your self-limitation is actually selflessness, that your refusal to pursue happiness is noble sacrifice for others who might be threatened by your success. It tells you that remaining small is humility, that avoiding joy is wisdom, that expecting disappointment is maturity. It transforms self-destruction into a moral imperative, making you feel guilty for even wanting more than the scraps of contentment it deems appropriate for someone like you. But there is another layer to this psychological architecture that we must examine if we are to understand the full scope of why we sabotage our own happiness. The saboteur does not operate in isolation. It draws its power from what depth psychology calls the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of human experience that connects your personal struggles to the struggles of your ancestors, your culture, your species itself. You carry within you not only your own fears and limitations, but the accumulated fears and limitations of your lineage. The grandmother who never spoke her truth, the grandfather who sacrificed his dreams for duty, the generations of ancestors who learned that survival meant invisibility, that safety meant settling, that love meant suffering. Their unresolved conflicts live in your cells, their unlived lives whisper in your dreams, their protective strategies echo in your automatic responses to opportunity and joy. This is why self-sabotage often feels so much larger than your personal psychology, why it seems to possess a weight and authority that exceeds your individual experience. You are not just fighting your own fears, you are wrestling with inherited patterns that run deeper than memory, ancestral scripts that were written in the blood and bone of those who came before you. The collective unconscious does not simply hand down trauma. It also transmits what we might call survival mythologies, stories about what it means to be human, about what we can expect from life, about the price that must be paid for every blessing. These mythologies operate like invisible software running in the background of consciousness, shaping our responses to possibility long before we become aware of our own thoughts. There is the mythology that tells us good things must be balanced by bad things, that the universe operates on some cosmic ledger system where every joy must be paid for with equal suffering. There is the mythology that whispers we are fundamentally flawed, that happiness is reserved for others more deserving, more pure, more worthy than ourselves. There is the mythology that insists struggle is noble while ease is suspicious, that we must earn our place in the light through endless penance in the darkness. These are not conscious beliefs. They are deeper than belief, embedded in the very structure of how we perceive reality. They function like gravitational fields, pulling us back toward familiar patterns of limitation whenever we attempt to escape their influence. And the saboteur within us becomes the enforcer of these mythologies, the internal agent of ancestral law that ensures we do not stray too far from the prescribed path of acceptable suffering. But here we encounter a profound paradox that lies at the heart of the human condition. The very mechanism that sabotages our happiness is also the mechanism that has enabled our species to survive. The hypervigilance that destroys our peace is the same hypervigilance that kept our ancestors alive in genuinely dangerous environments. The pessimism that poisons our joy is rooted in the same psychological architecture that helped previous generations navigate scarcity, predation, and uncertainty. The saboteur is not a foreign invader in the house of the psyche. It is a family member, a blood relative, a part of ourselves that shares our DNA and our deepest motivations. It wants what we want: safety, survival, the continuation of our genetic and psychological lineage, but it operates from information that is outdated, strategies that were adaptive in contexts that no longer exist, solutions that have become problems in a world that has fundamentally changed. This is why the work of overcoming self-sabotage cannot be approached as a war against the self. You cannot bomb the saboteur into submission without destroying the very foundations of your own psychological structure. You cannot simply amputate the parts of yourself that create limitations without understanding why those parts developed in the first place, what function they serve, what they are trying to protect. Instead, the path forward requires what I call archaeological compassion, the patient, careful excavation of your own inner landscape, with the understanding that every psychological formation, no matter how destructive it appears on the surface, was once a creative solution to an impossible situation. The saboteur was born from necessity, forged in the fires of genuine threat, shaped by circumstances that demanded its particular form of vigilant protection. When you can approach your own self-destructive patterns with this kind of respectful curiosity, when you can see the saboteur not as an enemy but as a part of yourself that has been working overtime to keep you safe, something profound begins to shift. The rigid automatic responses begin to soften. The hair trigger reactions begin to slow down. The ancient alarm system begins to recognize that the present moment is not the dangerous past it has been defending against. But this recognition does not happen through insight alone. The saboteur speaks the language of the body, of sensation, of felt experience. It was formed in moments of physical and emotional overwhelm, and it can only be transformed through practices that engage the whole of your being. Not just your thinking mind, but your feeling body, your breathing lungs, your beating heart. This is where many therapeutic approaches fall short. They attempt to address self-sabotage through purely cognitive means, as if you could reason your way out of patterns that were established long before you had the capacity for reason. They offer techniques for managing symptoms without addressing the underlying mythology that generates those symptoms. They treat the saboteur as a problem to be solved rather than as a part of the self that needs to be understood, honored, and gradually integrated into a more functional whole. The truth is that transformation happens not through elimination, but through expansion. The goal is not to destroy the protective mechanisms that have kept you alive, but to help them evolve, to update their understanding of current reality, to teach them new ways of ensuring your safety that do not require the sacrifice of your joy. This process begins with what depth psychology calls befriending the shadow. Instead of trying to overcome your self-destructive patterns, you begin by developing a relationship with them. You start to notice when the saboteur is activated, what triggers its protective responses, what it is trying to tell you about dangers it perceives in your environment or your choices. You learn to speak to this part of yourself not as a therapist speaking to a patient, but as one aspect of consciousness communicating with another. You acknowledge its years of faithful service, its genuine concern for your well-being, its sophisticated understanding of the ways that hope can become a liability in a world that seems designed to disappoint. And gradually, through this patient dialogue, through this respectful engagement with your own complexity, the saboteur begins to relax its vigilant grip. It begins to trust that you are not naive, that you have not forgotten the lessons it has been trying to teach you, that you can pursue happiness without abandoning the wisdom that comes from having survived difficult experiences. But this is only the beginning of the journey, because as the saboteur relaxes its control, as you begin to move toward greater fulfillment and joy, you inevitably encounter what might be called the happiness threshold, that invisible line beyond which your nervous system believes you are entering dangerous territory. This threshold is different for everyone. For some, it appears at the moment of professional success, when their career begins to flourish beyond their wildest expectations. For others, it emerges in intimate relationships, when love begins to feel too good, too secure, too much like the fairy tales they were taught not to believe in. Still others encounter it in moments of simple contentment, when life feels peaceful and manageable and free from the dramatic intensity they have learned to associate with being fully alive. The happiness threshold is guarded by what we might call the familiar demon, the particular form of suffering that has become so central to your identity that you cannot imagine who you would be without it. This demon is not abstract or metaphorical. It is a living presence in your psychological landscape, a pattern of thought and feeling and behavior that has been with you so long it feels like a part of your essential nature. For some, the familiar demon is anxiety, that constant hum of worry and anticipation that keeps them perpetually braced for disaster. For others, it is depression, that heavy blanket of meaninglessness that protects them from the vulnerability of caring too much about anything. Still others carry the demon of anger, of perfectionism, of chronic dissatisfaction, of romantic obsession, of spiritual superiority, of victimhood, of grandiosity, of self-pity. These demons are not simply symptoms to be medicated away or problems to be solved through willpower. They are complex psychological entities that serve multiple functions in the economy of the psyche. They provide identity, meaning, a sense of specialness, a way of relating to others, a familiar landscape in which to navigate the challenges of existence. The familiar demon offers a strange kind of comfort. It may cause suffering, but it is predictable suffering, manageable suffering, suffering that you understand and know how to navigate. It provides a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. Better the devil you know than the angel you don't. Better the familiar misery than the unknown territory of genuine well-being. And so, as you approach the happiness threshold, as you begin to move beyond the boundaries of your historically tolerable level of joy, the familiar demon awakens. It stirs from its slumber in the depths of your psyche and begins to reassert its presence in your daily experience. Old symptoms return with renewed intensity. Ancient fears resurface with surprising power. Patterns you thought you had outgrown suddenly dominate your thoughts and behaviors with the force of a psychological tsunami. This is not regression. This is not evidence that you are failing or moving backward in your development. This is the natural response of a system that is being asked to expand beyond its comfort zone, to tolerate levels of well-being that it has never before experienced as safe or sustainable. The familiar demon does not simply whisper its objections, It orchestrates elaborate productions, full theatrical performances designed to pull you back into the gravitational field of limitation. It becomes a master storyteller, weaving narratives so compelling, so emotionally resonant, that you find yourself believing them despite all evidence to the contrary. It tells you stories about impending doom, about the other shoe that must inevitably drop, about the cosmic law that demands payment for every moment of peace. It resurrects memories of past disappointments with surgical precision, selecting exactly those experiences that will most effectively undermine your current trajectory toward fulfillment. It creates phantom emergencies, manufactured crises, urgent problems that demand immediate attention and conveniently distract you from the dangerous business of being happy. But perhaps most cunningly, the familiar demon does not present itself as an enemy. It arrives dressed as your most trusted advisor, your voice of reason, your connection to reality. It speaks with the authority of hard-won experience, reminding you of all the times when optimism led to crushing disappointment, when trust resulted in betrayal, when opening your heart invited devastation. Remember, it whispers with the gentle concern of a worried friend. Remember how it felt when they left you. Remember the humiliation of that failure. Remember the way hope turned to ash in your mouth. Do you really want to risk that again? Do you really want to be that naive, that vulnerable, that foolish? Ish! And because this voice speaks from within your own consciousness, because it uses your own memories as its evidence, because it genuinely believes it is protecting you from unbearable pain, you listen. You slow down, you pull back, you create distance between yourself and the very experiences that could transform your life. This is the moment when many people abandon their journey toward happiness. They encounter the resistance of the familiar demon, feel the intensity of their own psychological immune system's response to joy, and conclude that they were not meant for fulfillment. They interpret the demon's activation as a sign that they are pushing too hard, wanting too much, reaching beyond their proper station in the hierarchy of human suffering. But what they do not understand is that this resistance is not a stop sign. It is a threshold guardian. In ancient mythologies, threshold guardians appeared whenever heroes attempted to enter new territories, to claim new powers, to evolve beyond their current limitations. These guardians were not there to prevent passage, they were there to test resolve, to ensure that only those truly committed to transformation would be allowed to proceed. The familiar demon serves the same function in the landscape of the psyche. Its fierce resistance to your happiness is not evidence that you should abandon your quest for fulfillment. It is evidence that you are approaching something significant, something that has the power to fundamentally alter the structure of your inner world. But crossing this threshold requires more than willpower or positive thinking. It requires what the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, work against nature, work that goes against the natural tendency of psychological systems to maintain their current configuration. It requires a willingness to feel the full intensity of your own resistance without being overwhelmed by it, to hold steady in the face of your own internal storm. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the journey toward authentic happiness, learning to distinguish between the voice of genuine intuition and the voice of the familiar demon. Both speak from within your own consciousness. Both claim to have your best interests at heart. Both can present compelling arguments for their particular perspective on what you should or should not do. The difference lies not in the content of their messages, but in their underlying energy signature. Genuine intuition speaks with a quality of spacious clarity, even when it delivers difficult truths. It does not create urgency or panic. It does not flood your nervous system with anxiety or despair. It offers guidance that feels both challenging and supportive, both honest and compassionate. The familiar demon, by contrast, speaks with the energy of emergency. Its messages carry an undertone of hysteria, a sense that terrible things will happen if you do not immediately heed its warnings. It creates pressure, generates urgency, floods your system with stress hormones designed to mobilize you for fight or flight. Even when its advice seems reasonable on the surface, it delivers that advice with an intensity that feels disproportionate to the actual circumstances you are facing. Learning to recognize this energetic signature is crucial because the familiar demon is nothing if not adaptive. As you begin to see through its more obvious manipulations, it evolves, becomes more sophisticated, develops new strategies for maintaining its influence over your choices. It learns to speak in the language of spiritual wisdom, psychological insight, practical necessity, whatever vocabulary will most effectively convince you to abandon your movement toward greater fulfillment. It might appear as spiritual humility, suggesting that your desire for happiness is somehow selfish or unenlightened. It might masquerade as psychological sophistication, convincing you that truly mature people do not expect life to be fulfilling. It might present itself as practical realism, arguing that you should be grateful for what you have rather than always wanting more. But beneath all these disguises, beneath all these reasonable-sounding arguments, the familiar demon carries the same core message. You are safer when you suffer. You are more acceptable when you struggle. You are more lovable when you need fixing. Do not risk the unknown territory of genuine well-being. This message is so deeply embedded in the fabric of human psychology that it often feels like truth rather than conditioning. We live in a culture that glorifies struggle, that treats happiness with suspicion, that assumes people who claim to be fulfilled must be either lying or deluded. We are surrounded by mythologies that equate suffering with nobility, that suggest ease is somehow morally inferior to difficulty. These cultural messages amplify and reinforce the familiar demon's influence, creating a kind of collective conspiracy against human flourishing. You are not just fighting your own internal resistance to happiness. You are swimming against the current of a civilization that has forgotten how to trust joy, how to welcome peace, how to celebrate the simple miracle of a life lived with contentment and grace. But here is what the familiar demon does not want you to understand. Your happiness is not a luxury. It is not selfish indulgence or naive optimism or spiritual bypassing. Your happiness is a revolutionary act, a form of resistance against all the forces, internal and external, that would keep you small, scared, and safely contained within the boundaries of acceptable limitation. When you choose fulfillment despite your conditioning, when you pursue joy despite your programming, when you insist on your right to a life of meaning and satisfaction, despite all the voices that tell you such things are not for people like you, you are not just healing yourself. You are healing the ancestral line that runs through you. You are challenging the collective agreements that keep entire populations trapped in cycles of unnecessary suffering. Your joy becomes a beacon for others who have been told they do not deserve happiness. Your peace becomes permission for others to lay down their own familiar demons. Your fulfillment becomes proof that transformation is possible, that the human condition is not fixed, that we are not condemned to repeat the patterns of limitation that have been passed down through generations of wounded ancestors. This is why the resistance is so fierce. This is why the familiar demon fights so hard to maintain its control. Your individual happiness threatens entire systems of belief, entire economies of suffering, entire cultures built on the assumption that pain is inevitable and joy is illusory. But the demon's resistance also reveals its fundamental weakness. If your happiness were truly impossible, if fulfillment were genuinely beyond your reach, there would be no need for such elaborate psychological defenses against it. The very intensity of the resistance suggests that what you seek is not only possible, but imminent, so close that your unconscious can sense its approach and mobilizes every available resource to prevent its arrival. This is the moment when the real work begins, not the work of overcoming resistance, but the work of dancing with it. Not the work of defeating the familiar demon, but the work of transforming your relationship with it. Not the work of eliminating fear, but the work of expanding your capacity to feel afraid while continuing to move toward what calls to your deepest self. The path forward requires what we might call courageous tenderness, the ability to hold both your longing for happiness and your terror of it with equal compassion. It requires developing what the Buddhists call the warrior's heart, not the heart that fights against what it encounters, but the heart that remains open in the presence of difficulty, that continues to love even in the face of its own resistance. This warrior's heart does not emerge through effort or discipline alone. It develops through practice, through the repeated experience of choosing love over fear, expansion over contraction, truth over comfort. Each time you feel the familiar demon's activation and choose to move forward anyway, you strengthen neural pathways of courage. Each time you notice the voice of limitation and choose to listen instead to the whisper of possibility, you weaken the demon's hold on your nervous system. But this practice requires extraordinary patience with yourself, extraordinary forgiveness for the times when you inevitably succumb to the demon's influence. The journey toward authentic happiness is not a straight line. It is a spiral, a dance, a complex negotiation between different aspects of yourself that have been at war for longer than you can remember. There will be days when you feel like you are making tremendous progress, when the familiar demon seems quiet and cooperative, when happiness feels natural and sustainable. And there will be other days when you feel like you are back at the beginning, when old patterns reassert themselves with surprising force, when the very idea of fulfillment seems like a cruel joke you have been playing on yourself. Both experiences are part of the process. Both are necessary movements in the larger dance of transformation. The setbacks are not evidence of failure. They are opportunities for deeper integration, chances to develop more sophisticated strategies for working with your own complexity. What changes is not the presence of resistance, but your relationship to it. Instead of being overwhelmed by the familiar demon's activation, you begin to recognize it as information. Instead of being paralyzed by your own fear, you begin to use that fear as a compass, pointing you toward exactly those experiences that have the greatest potential to expand your capacity for joy. The demon's voice becomes not a command to be obeyed, but a signal to be interpreted. When it screams warnings about the dangers of happiness, you hear its underlying message. Something important is happening here. Something that could change everything. Pay attention. And you do pay attention, but not in the way the demon expects. Instead of retreating, you lean in. Instead of contracting, you expand. Instead of abandoning your movement toward fulfillment, you use the demon's very presence as confirmation that you are moving in the right direction. This is the alchemical moment, when resistance transforms from obstacle into ally, when the familiar demon reveals itself to be not your enemy, but your teacher, not your limitation, but your liberation in disguise. The very mechanism that has been sabotaging your happiness becomes the mechanism through which deeper happiness emerges. But this transformation is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process, a lifelong practice of learning to dance with your own complexity. Each new level of fulfillment activates new levels of resistance. Each expansion of joy reveals new depths of fear. Each movement toward authentic happiness uncovers new layers of conditioning that must be met with compassion and integrated with wisdom. This is why sustainable happiness cannot be achieved through quick fixes or simple techniques. It requires what we might call psychological citizenship, the willingness to take full responsibility for the inner landscape of your own consciousness, to become an active participant in the ongoing creation of your own experience. Such citizenship demands that you develop new skills, new capacities, new ways of being with yourself that most people never learn. You must become fluent in the language of your own nervous system, able to read the subtle signals that indicate when you are approaching your happiness threshold. You must develop the capacity to self-regulate, to soothe your own activation without numbing your aliveness. You must learn to hold paradox, to feel fear and excitement simultaneously, to move toward what you want while honoring what you are afraid of losing. Most importantly, you must cultivate what the mystics have called beginner's mind, the ability to approach each moment of your experience with fresh eyes, without the burden of past conclusions about what is possible for someone like you. The familiar demon feeds on the stories you tell yourself about your limitations, the narratives you have constructed about why happiness is not available to you.
Hey.
But in beginner's mind, these stories lose their power. In beginner's mind, each moment offers new possibilities, new choices, new opportunities to surprise yourself with your own capacity for joy. In beginner's mind, the future is not determined by the past, and your potential for fulfillment is not limited by your history of disappointment. This is perhaps the most radical act of all, to approach your own life as if happiness were not only possible, but inevitable, as if fulfillment were not a distant dream, but your natural state temporarily obscured by clouds of conditioning, to live as if joy were your birthright rather than your burden, as if peace were your inheritance rather than your impossibility. When you begin to embody this possibility, when you begin to live from this assumption, something extraordinary happens. The familiar demon does not disappear, but it begins to serve a different function. Instead of being your limitation, it becomes your discrimination. Instead of keeping you small, it helps you choose wisely. Instead of preventing happiness, it helps you create sustainable happiness. Joy that is rooted in truth rather than illusion. Fulfillment that can withstand the inevitable challenges of human existence. The demon's voice becomes a valuable part of your inner counsel, offering perspective and caution without demanding control. Its fears become information rather than commands. Its warnings become wisdom rather than walls. You learn to thank it for its concern while making your own choices about how to proceed. And in this new relationship, in this transformed dynamic between your longing for happiness and your fear of it, something miraculous emerges. You discover that the very thing you have been most afraid of, your own potential for joy, is also the thing you have been most hungry for. You realize that the happiness you have been sabotaging is not separate from you, but is your own essential nature, temporarily hidden beneath layers of protective conditioning. This recognition changes everything. The journey toward happiness is no longer a matter of acquiring something you lack, but of removing the obstacles to what you already are. The work is not about becoming someone else, but about becoming more fully yourself, the self that exists beneath the familiar demon's influence, the self that has always known how to be happy, but has forgotten how to trust that knowing. This recognition initiates what we might call the Great Remembering. Not a recovery of lost memories, but a return to an original way of being that existed before the layers of protection were necessary. But this remembering does not happen all at once. It unfolds like a flower opening to sunlight, slowly, petal by petal, as each defensive structure learns to trust the warmth it has been guarding against. The process begins with what I call sacred witnessing, the practice of observing your own internal landscape without immediately rushing to fix, change, or improve what you find there. Most people, when they first glimpse their own self-sabotaging patterns, respond with a kind of psychological violence. They attack their own resistance, wage war against their fears, attempt to bulldoze their way through obstacles that have taken decades to construct. But the psyche does not respond well to force. It is more like a wild animal than a machine. Approach it with aggression, and it will either flee deeper into hiding or turn defensive and dangerous. Approach it with patience and respect, however, and it may gradually reveal secrets that have been hidden for lifetimes. Sacred witnessing requires a fundamental shift in your relationship to your own experience. Instead of being the prosecutor of your own limitations, you become their anthropologist. Instead of judging your patterns as wrong or pathological, you study them with the fascination of a scientist discovering a new species. What purpose do they serve? Under what conditions do they emerge? What are they trying to protect? What do they need in order to relax their vigilant grip? This witnessing must be embodied, not merely intellectual. You cannot observe your own sabotage from the safety of your thinking mind while remaining disconnected from the felt sense of what is actually happening in your body, your emotions, your energy field. The familiar demon speaks primarily through sensation, through the subtle language of tension and release, expansion and contraction, aliveness and numbness. When you begin to pay attention to these somatic signals, you discover that self-sabotage has a physical signature. There is a particular way your shoulders hold themselves when you are about to abandon a dream. There is a specific quality of breathing that accompanies the decision to settle for less than what you truly want. There is a recognizable sensation in your chest that precedes the familiar demon's most convincing arguments against your own happiness. Learning to read these signals is like learning to speak a language you have been hearing all your life but never understood. Suddenly you have early warning systems for your own self-destructive patterns. You can feel the sabotage gathering momentum before it fully manifests in your behavior. You can sense the familiar demon stirring from its slumber before it launches into its elaborate productions designed to pull you back into limitation. But early warning is only the beginning. The real skill lies in learning what to do with this information once you have it. Most people, when they first become aware of their self-sabotaging impulses, make the mistake of trying to suppress them through willpower. They grit their teeth, clench their fists, and attempt to force themselves forward despite the screaming protests of their internal protection systems. This approach inevitably fails because it treats the symptom rather than the cause. The familiar demon is not the problem, it is the expression of a deeper wound that has never been properly tended. Trying to override its warnings without addressing its underlying concerns is like trying to silence a smoke alarm without putting out the fire. The alarm will only get louder, more insistent, more creative in its attempts to get your attention. What is needed instead is what the depth psychologists call active imagination, a conscious dialogue between different aspects of your psyche, a respectful negotiation between the part of you that wants to grow and the part that wants to stay safe. This dialogue cannot happen at the level of rational thought alone. It requires descending into the symbolic realm where the familiar demon actually lives and speaks. In this realm, your self-sabotaging patterns appear not as abstract psychological concepts, but as living images, archetypal figures with their own personalities, histories, and motivations. The part of you that fears success might appear as a worried parent, constantly scanning the horizon for dangers that could befall a child who dares to shine too brightly. The part that sabotages relationships might manifest as a battle-scarred warrior, armed with the weapons of past betrayals, ready to strike first before being struck. These inner figures are not metaphors or therapeutic conveniences. They are autonomous aspects of your psyche that possess their own intelligence, their own agendas, their own legitimate concerns about your welfare. They have been shaped by real experiences of pain and disappointment. They carry genuine wisdom about the ways that hope can become a liability in a world that does not always reward vulnerability with kindness. To engage with these figures effectively, you must approach them as you would approach any sentient being whose cooperation you need. You cannot command them into submission, but you can earn their trust. You cannot force them to change, but you can create conditions in which they might choose to evolve. You cannot eliminate them, but you can help them find new ways to fulfill their protective function without sabotaging your movement toward joy. This process requires what we might call diplomatic immunity, the ability to enter into dialogue with aspects of yourself that may be hostile to your conscious goals without being overwhelmed by their resistance or seduced by their arguments. You must develop the capacity to listen to the familiar demon's concerns without automatically accepting its conclusions, to feel its fear without being paralyzed by it, to honor its protective intention without surrendering your commitment to growth. The dialogue often begins with a simple acknowledgement. I see you. I feel your concern. I understand that you are trying to protect me from something you believe could hurt me. This acknowledgement alone can begin to shift the dynamic from warfare to negotiation, from opposition to collaboration. But the familiar demon is not easily convinced. It has been your faithful guardian for years, perhaps decades. It has witnessed every disappointment, catalogued every betrayal, internalized every message that suggested you were not worthy of the happiness you seek. It will test your sincerity, challenge your commitment, demand proof that you have not forgotten the lessons it has been trying to teach you. This is where many people falter in their journey toward authentic happiness. They approach the dialogue with their internal protector as a mere technique, a psychological exercise designed to quickly resolve their resistance so they can get on with the business of being fulfilled. But the familiar demon can sense insincerity from miles away. It knows when you are trying to manipulate it rather than genuinely understand it. Authentic dialogue requires genuine curiosity about your own complexity, real respect for the intelligence of your protective mechanisms, actual gratitude for the years of faithful service your familiar demon has provided. It demands that you slow down, that you resist the cultural pressure to fix yourself quickly and efficiently, that you allow the conversation to unfold at its own organic pace. Sometimes this dialogue happens through dreams, where your unconscious presents symbolic scenarios that reveal the deeper dynamics at play in your resistance to happiness. You might dream of being chased by a figure that, upon closer examination, bears a striking resemblance to a younger version of yourself, the child who learned that being too happy was dangerous, who developed elaborate strategies for staying safe through self-limitation. Other times, the dialogue manifests through what depth psychology calls active imagination, a practice of consciously engaging with the images and figures that arise from your unconscious mind. You might sit quietly and invite the familiar demon to show itself, to take a form you can see and dialogue with directly. What does it look like? How does it move? What does it need you to understand? These conversations are not always comfortable. The familiar demon often carries messages that challenge your most cherished beliefs about yourself and your potential. It might remind you of failures you have tried to forget, wounds you thought you had healed, patterns you believed you had outgrown. It might present evidence that seems to contradict your movement toward happiness, arguments that feel more compelling than you want to admit. But this discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are finally addressing the real issues, finally having the conversations that need to happen before authentic transformation can occur. The familiar demon's resistance is proportional to the significance of what you are attempting to change. Its intensity reflects the magnitude of the expansion you are seeking. As the dialogue deepens, as trust begins to develop between your conscious intentions and your unconscious protections, something remarkable begins to emerge. The familiar demon starts to reveal not just its fears, but its deeper wisdom, not just its resistance, but its genuine desire to serve your highest good. You begin to understand that its sabotage has always been a form of love, misguided perhaps, outdated certainly, but rooted in a fundamental commitment to your survival and well-being. This recognition transforms everything. The familiar demon is no longer your enemy, but your ally, no longer your limitation, but your discrimination. It begins to evolve from a crude protective mechanism into a sophisticated inner advisor, one that can help you navigate the genuine complexities of creating sustainable happiness in a world that is indeed filled with real challenges and legitimate dangers. But this evolution does not happen overnight. It requires ongoing attention, regular check-ins, continued dialogue between your growing capacity for joy and your inherited wisdom about survival. The familiar demon must be retrained gradually, taught new ways to fulfill its protective function that do not require the sacrifice of your fulfillment. This retraining happens through what we might call graduated exposure, the careful, intentional practice of moving slightly beyond your comfort zone while maintaining open communication with your internal protection systems. Instead of making dramatic leaps toward happiness that trigger massive resistance, You take small steps that allow your nervous system to gradually adjust to higher levels of well-being. You might begin by allowing yourself to feel good for slightly longer periods than usual before the familiar demon intervenes. If you typically sabotage joy within minutes of experiencing it, you practice extending that window to 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. You learn to surf the waves of your own resistance rather than being overwhelmed by them. Each successful navigation of these waves teaches your nervous system that happiness is not as dangerous as it has been programmed to believe. Each moment of sustained joy, without catastrophic consequences, weakens the familiar demon's conviction that fulfillment inevitably leads to disaster. Each experience of moving through fear toward what you truly want strengthens your capacity to do so again. But this process is not merely about desensitization or gradual exposure. It is about fundamental rewiring of the neural pathways that connect pleasure with danger, success with abandonment, love with loss. This rewiring happens not just through repeated exposure, but through what neuroscientists call corrective emotional experiences. Moments when your expectations of disaster are met instead with safety, support, and continued well-being. These corrective experiences must be embodied, felt in the body, as well as understood by the mind. It is not enough to intellectually grasp that happiness is safe. Your nervous system must feel that safety at a cellular level. This felt sense of safety develops through practices that engage your entire being. Breath work that teaches your body how to stay relaxed in the presence of joy. Movement practices that help you express and integrate expanded states of aliveness. Meditation techniques that train your awareness to rest in well-being without immediately seeking escape. The work also requires what we might call relational healing, the experience of being truly seen and accepted by others while in states of happiness rather than just in states of struggle. Many people have learned to connect with others through shared suffering, mutual commiseration, bonding over difficulties and disappointments. They feel most loved when they are most broken, most needed when they are most needy. Learning to be loved while happy, to be seen while successful, to be valued while fulfilled requires finding relationships that can celebrate your joy rather than being threatened by it. This often means grieving the loss of connections that were built on mutual limitation, relationships that cannot survive your movement toward authentic happiness because they depend on your remaining small and safe and perpetually in need of fixing. Such grief is necessary but not easy. The familiar demon will use these losses as evidence that happiness is indeed dangerous, that fulfillment comes at too high a cost, that you were better off when you were safely miserable and surrounded by others who shared your limitations. But this grief, when properly mourned, becomes compost for new growth. It clears space for relationships that can hold your fullness, connections that celebrate your expansion rather than requiring your contraction. As this relational healing unfolds, as you find others who can witness your joy without needing to diminish it, something profound begins to shift in your internal landscape. The familiar demon starts to realize that happiness does not equal isolation, that success does not require abandonment, that shining your light does not mean losing love. Its protective strategies begin to evolve, becoming more sophisticated, more nuanced, more aligned with the reality of your current circumstances rather than the dangers of your historical past. This evolution is not a betrayal of the familiar demon's essential nature, but a fulfillment of its deepest purpose. It has always wanted to keep you safe and connected and alive. When it discovers that happiness can actually serve these goals better than limitation, when it learns that joy can be a form of protection rather than a form of exposure, it begins to shift its allegiance from the familiar patterns of the past to the emerging possibilities of the future. But even as this shift occurs, even as the familiar demon begins to support rather than sabotage your movement toward happiness, new challenges emerge. Success in overcoming self-sabotage brings its own complexities, its own temptations, its own shadows that must be faced with honesty and humility. There is the shadow of spiritual pride, the temptation to believe that having worked through your resistance to happiness makes you somehow superior to those who are still struggling with their own limitations. There is the shadow of bypassing, the tendency to use your newfound capacity for joy as a way of avoiding the genuine difficulties and sorrows that are also part of the human experience. There is the shadow of inflation, the danger of becoming so identified with your happiness that you lose touch with the full spectrum of human emotion, the rich complexity that includes both light and dark, both expansion and contraction, both celebration and grief. Authentic happiness is not the absence of difficulty, but the capacity to remain centered and connected in the presence of life's full range of experiences. These shadows require the same patient attention, the same respectful dialogue, the same willingness to look honestly at your own complexity that you brought to working with the familiar demon. They are not problems to be solved, but aspects of the psyche to be integrated, new levels of sophistication in your ongoing relationship with your own wholeness. The journey toward authentic happiness is not a destination, but a way of traveling, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. It requires developing what we might call spiritual maturity, the capacity to hold both your longing for fulfillment and your acceptance of imperfection, both your commitment to growth and your compassion for your limitations, both your movement toward joy and your willingness to feel whatever needs to be felt along the way. This maturity emerges not through perfecting yourself, but through accepting yourself, not through eliminating your shadows, but through dancing with them, not through transcending your humanity, but through embracing it more fully. It is the recognition that your capacity for happiness is not separate from your capacity for sorrow, that your ability to experience joy is deepened rather than diminished by your willingness to feel pain. In this recognition, the whole project of overcoming self-sabotage reveals itself to be something far more profound than a personal improvement program. It becomes a form of service to the collective human experience, a contribution to the healing of our species' relationship with joy, fulfillment, and the possibility of living with both feet firmly planted on the earth while reaching toward the stars. Your individual happiness becomes a gift to the world, not because it makes you perfect, but because it makes you real. It demonstrates that transformation is possible, that the human heart can learn to trust again, that we are not condemned to repeat the patterns of limitation that have been passed down through generations of wounded ancestors. But this gift can only be given from a place of genuine integration, not from a place of spiritual performance or psychological achievement. It must emerge from the deep well of your own lived experience, your own patient work with your own complexity, your own willingness to face both the light and shadow of your own nature with equal reverence. The familiar demon, in its evolved form, becomes your ally in this integration. It helps you discern between authentic happiness and its counterfeits, between genuine fulfillment and its substitutes, between sustainable joy and its temporary approximations. It becomes the guardian not of your limitations, but of your authenticity, not of your fears, but of your truth. And in this new alliance, in this transformed relationship between your longing for happiness and your wisdom about its challenges, you discover something extraordinary. You realize that the happiness you have been seeking was never a destination to be reached, but a capacity to be developed, never a prize to be won, but a skill to be mastered, never a permanent state to be achieved, but a dynamic process to be engaged with moment by moment, breath by breath, choice by choice. This happiness is not fragile or conditional or dependent on external circumstances. It is robust and resilient and rooted in your own essential nature. It can withstand loss and disappointment and failure because it is not based on having everything go your way, but on your capacity to remain connected to what matters most, regardless of what life brings. Such happiness does not eliminate suffering, but transforms your relationship to it. Pain becomes information rather than identity. Challenges become opportunities rather than evidence of cosmic unfairness. Difficulties become compost for growth rather than proof of personal inadequacy. You learn to surf the waves of experience rather than being overwhelmed by them, to dance with change rather than being paralyzed by it. This is the happiness that the familiar demon, in its wisdom, has always been trying to protect. Not the shallow, temporary pleasure that comes and goes with circumstances, but the deep, abiding sense of aliveness and connection and meaning that is your birthright as a human being. The demon's resistance was never to your happiness itself, but to the counterfeits that masquerade as happiness while actually leading you further from your true nature. When you understand this distinction, when you learn to recognize authentic happiness by its fruits rather than its promises, the whole journey of working with self-sabotage begins to make sense. The familiar demon was never your enemy, but your discriminating wisdom, never your limitation, but your protection against settling for less than what you truly deserve. And what you truly deserve is not just happiness, but wholeness, not just joy, but integration, not just fulfillment, but the full expression of your unique gifts in service of something larger than your personal satisfaction. This is the happiness that emerges when self-sabotage transforms into self-sovereignty, when resistance becomes discernment, when the familiar demon becomes your wisest counselor in the ongoing adventure of becoming fully human. This recognition opens what we might call the chamber of authentic choice, a space within consciousness where decisions emerge not from compulsion or conditioning, but from the deep wells of your own truth. Most people live their entire lives without ever entering this chamber, making choices instead from the surface layers of personality, from the accumulated debris of other people's expectations, from the familiar scripts that were written long before they had the capacity to question their authorship. But when you begin to work consciously with the familiar demon, when you develop the capacity to feel its activation without being overwhelmed by it, you gain access to a different quality of decision-making entirely. You learn to pause in the space between stimulus and response, to create what the contemplatives call sacred delay. that precious moment when you can choose your response rather than simply react from pattern. This sacred delay is where transformation lives. It is the crack in the armor of conditioning through which new possibilities can enter. But it requires tremendous courage to inhabit this space, because it means facing the full weight of your own responsibility for the direction of your life. As long as you are driven by unconscious patterns, as long as the familiar demon operates from the shadows, you can maintain the illusion that your limitations are imposed upon you by forces beyond your control. When you step into conscious choice, when you begin to see clearly the mechanisms by which you create your own suffering, that illusion dissolves. You can no longer blame your unhappiness on circumstances, on other people, on bad luck or cosmic injustice. You must face the uncomfortable truth that you have been an active participant in your own limitation, that your misery has been at least partially self-authored. This recognition can initially feel devastating. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with realizing how much of your suffering has been optional, how many years you have spent trapped in prisons of your own construction. The familiar demon will use this grief as ammunition, whispering that it is too late now, that too much time has been wasted, that you might as well continue with the patterns that have become so familiar they feel like home. But this grief, when fully felt and properly metabolized, becomes the doorway to genuine freedom. It is the grief of awakening, the sorrow that accompanies the death of the illusions that have outlived their usefulness. Like all authentic grief, it carries within it the seeds of new life, new possibilities, new ways of being that were impossible as long as the old patterns remained unconscious and unexamined. The process of metabolizing this grief requires what we might call archetypal witnessing, the capacity to see your personal story within the larger context of human experience, to recognize that your particular form of self-sabotage is part of a universal pattern that has been playing out in individual lives for millennia. You are not uniquely broken or specially cursed. You are participating in the great human drama of awakening, the collective journey from unconsciousness to awareness that defines our species' evolution. This archetypal perspective does not diminish the reality of your personal pain, but it places that pain within a framework of meaning that can make it bearable, even sacred. Your struggle with self-sabotage becomes part of the larger story of human beings learning to trust their own capacity for joy, learning to believe in their own worthiness of love, learning to inhabit their full potential rather than hiding in the familiar confines of limitation. But archetypal witnessing alone is not sufficient for transformation. It must be accompanied by what depth psychology calls embodied integration, the slow, patient work of teaching your nervous system new patterns of response, new ways of being in relationship with both pleasure and pain, expansion and contraction, success and failure. This integration happens not through dramatic breakthroughs or sudden enlightenment, but through the accumulation of small moments of conscious choice, tiny acts of courage that gradually rewire the neural pathways of self-sabotage. Each time you feel the familiar demon stirring and choose to breathe rather than react, you strengthen your capacity for presence. Each time you notice the impulse to sabotage and pause to inquire into its deeper message, you develop your skill in conscious dialogue with the unconscious. Each time you allow yourself to feel good for just a moment longer than usual, you expand your nervous system's tolerance for joy. Each time you choose truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, growth over safety, you carve new channels in the landscape of your psyche through which different possibilities can flow. These moments of choice often arise in the most mundane circumstances. The familiar demon does not only activate during major life transitions or dramatic crises, it is equally present in the small decisions of daily existence, whether to express appreciation to someone you love, whether to pursue an opportunity that excites you, whether to speak your truth in a conversation where lies would be more convenient. It is in these ordinary moments that the real work of transformation happens, not in the grand gestures or heroic efforts that make for compelling stories, but in the quiet consistency of choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, awareness over automation, love over fear. The familiar demon has built its power through countless small surrenders to limitation. It can only be transformed through countless small acts of liberation. But this work is not meant to be done in isolation. The human psyche is fundamentally relational, shaped by connection and healed through communion. The patterns of self-sabotage that seem so personal, so private, so shamefully individual are actually collective wounds that have been passed down through generations of human beings who learned to mistrust their own capacity for happiness. This means that healing these patterns requires not just individual work, but what we might call collective witnessing. The experience of being seen and held by others who understand the depth of the struggle, who can recognize the courage required to face one's own resistance to joy, who can celebrate the small victories that might seem insignificant to those who have never wrestled with their own familiar demons. Such witnessing cannot be found in casual social connections or superficial relationships built on mutual entertainment or distraction. It requires finding what the mystics have called soul friends, those rare companions who can see through the masks and personas to the essential self that is always seeking expression, always longing for recognition, always yearning to be known in its fullness rather than just its acceptable aspects. These soul friendships often form around shared commitment to growth, mutual dedication to truth, reciprocal willingness to be both witness and witnessed in the vulnerable process of becoming. They are not relationships of convenience or comfort, but of sacred purpose, bonds forged in the fires of authentic transformation and maintained through the ongoing choice to support each other's highest becoming. In the presence of such witnessing, the familiar demon begins to lose some of its power over your choices. When you are truly seen and loved while in the process of struggling with your own limitations, when you experience acceptance that includes rather than excludes your shadows, when you feel held in your wholeness rather than just your lightness, something fundamental shifts in your relationship to yourself. The voice that has been telling you that you must remain small to remain lovable begins to quiet. The conviction that you must suffer to be worthy begins to weaken. The belief that happiness will lead to abandonment begins to dissolve in the lived experience of being celebrated for your joy rather than pitied for your pain. But finding such relationships requires a willingness to be vulnerable in ways that the familiar demon has been protecting you from for years. It means revealing aspects of yourself that you have kept hidden, sharing struggles that you have convinced yourself make you unlovable, expressing needs that you have learned to consider shameful or excessive. This vulnerability is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire journey toward authentic happiness. The familiar demon would rather maintain its protective strategies than risk the potential devastation of being truly seen and potentially rejected. It will create compelling arguments for why such openness is dangerous, why revealing your struggles will drive others away, why it is better to maintain the illusion of having everything together than to risk the chaos of authentic connection. These arguments carry the weight of historical truth. Many people have indeed been rejected for their vulnerability, punished for their authenticity, abandoned for their complexity. The familiar demon's warnings are not entirely paranoid. They are based on real experiences of real pain that occurred when trust was met with betrayal, when openness was met with judgment, when love was offered and returned with cruelty. But the familiar demon cannot distinguish between past dangers and present possibilities. It operates from a database of historical information that may no longer be relevant to current circumstances. The people who wounded you in the past are not the people who are available to love you in the present. The contexts that made vulnerability dangerous in your childhood are not the contexts in which you now have the opportunity to create healing connections. Learning to make this distinction requires developing what we might call temporal discernment, the capacity to recognize when you are responding to present circumstances from past conditioning, when you are projecting historical patterns onto current relationships, when you are allowing yesterday's wounds to prevent today's healing. This discernment develops through practice, through the gradual process of taking small risks in connection and observing the results. Instead of waiting until you feel completely safe before being vulnerable, you learn to titrate your openness, sharing small truths and watching how they are received, revealing minor struggles and noticing whether you are met with judgment or compassion. Each positive response strengthens your capacity for greater intimacy. Each experience of being seen and accepted in your imperfection challenges the familiar demon's conviction that authenticity leads to abandonment. Each moment of connection that includes rather than excludes your shadows provides evidence that love is possible not despite your limitations, but including them. But this process cannot be rushed or forced. The familiar demon has legitimate concerns about the pace of vulnerability, valid warnings about the dangers of opening too quickly to people who may not be equipped to hold what you share. Learning to honor these concerns while not being paralyzed by them requires developing what we might call graduated intimacy, the skill of revealing yourself at a pace that feels both challenging and sustainable. This skill involves learning to read the subtle cues that indicate when someone is ready for deeper connection, when a relationship has developed sufficient trust to hold more complexity, when the timing is right for greater transparency. It requires developing sensitivity to your own nervous system's signals about safety and danger. Learning to trust your intuitive sense of who can be trusted with what aspects of your inner world. As this capacity for graduated intimacy develops, as you begin to experience the healing that comes from being truly known and still loved, something profound begins to shift in your relationship to your own happiness. The familiar demon's warnings about the dangers of joy begin to feel less urgent, less immediately relevant to your current circumstances. You begin to accumulate lived evidence that happiness does not necessarily lead to abandonment, that success does not automatically result in isolation, that shining your light does not inevitably attract those who would seek to extinguish it. This evidence is not theoretical or philosophical, but embodied and experiential, carved into your nervous system through repeated encounters with love that celebrates rather than fears your expansion. But even as this shift occurs, even as you begin to trust more deeply in your right to happiness and your capacity to maintain connection while pursuing fulfillment, new layers of the familiar demon's protective structure begin to emerge. Like an archaeological dig that reveals deeper artifacts as the surface layers are removed, working with self-sabotage often uncovers increasingly subtle and sophisticated forms of resistance. These deeper layers often involve what we might call existential fears, anxieties not just about personal consequences, but about the meaning and purpose of existence itself. The familiar demon begins to raise questions that go beyond individual safety and survival. What if happiness is ultimately meaningless? What if joy is just a distraction from the fundamental suffering that defines the human condition? What if pursuing fulfillment is just another form of spiritual materialism, another way of avoiding the truth of impermanence and death? These existential challenges cannot be dismissed as mere psychological resistance. They touch on genuine philosophical and spiritual questions that have occupied human beings for millennia. They require a response that goes beyond personal healing to encompass what we might call cosmological integration, the development of a worldview that can hold both the reality of suffering and the possibility of joy, both the truth of impermanence and the value of creating meaning within that impermanence. This cosmological integration often involves what the depth psychologists call an encounter with the collective unconscious, that vast reservoir of human experience that contains not just personal memories but archetypal patterns, mythic structures, and symbolic forms that have shaped human consciousness across cultures and centuries. In this encounter, your personal struggle with self-sabotage reveals itself to be part of a much larger story about the human condition itself. You begin to see your familiar demon not just as a personal protective mechanism, but as a manifestation of archetypal forces that have been present in human experience since consciousness first emerged from the primordial darkness. The voice that tells you happiness is dangerous is the same voice that has whispered to countless generations of human beings, the same archetypal pattern that has shaped mythologies and religions and philosophical systems across the globe. This recognition can be both liberating and overwhelming. Liberating because it removes the burden of believing that your struggles are unique or shameful, overwhelming because it reveals the magnitude of what you are working with when you choose to pursue authentic happiness. You are not just healing personal wounds, but participating in the collective evolution of human consciousness itself. But this participation is not a burden to be carried alone. The same collective unconscious that contains the archetypal patterns of limitation also holds the archetypal patterns of liberation, transformation, and transcendence. The mythic structures that have shaped human resistance to joy also contain the blueprints for overcoming that resistance, the symbolic maps that have guided countless individuals through the journey from unconsciousness to awakening. These archetypal resources become available to you as you deepen your work with the familiar demon, as you learn to dialogue not just with your personal protective mechanisms, but with the larger patterns they represent. You begin to recognize yourself in the ancient stories of heroes who faced their dragons, seekers who descended into underworlds, initiates who died to their old selves and were reborn into new possibilities. Your personal journey toward happiness begins to resonate with these larger narratives, drawing strength and guidance from the accumulated wisdom of human beings who have walked similar paths before you. The familiar demon's voice begins to sound less like personal pathology and more like one movement in a vast symphony of human becoming that has been playing out across millennia. This archetypal perspective provides a container large enough to hold the full complexity of the transformation process. It offers a framework for understanding why the work is so difficult, why the resistance is so fierce, why the stakes feel so high. You are not just changing personal habits or healing individual wounds. You are participating in the ongoing evolution of what it means to be human. But this grand perspective must be balanced with intimate attention to the small daily choices through which transformation actually occurs. The archetypal dimension provides meaning and context, but the real work happens in the mundane moments when you choose presence over distraction, truth over comfort, love over fear. It happens in the conversation where you speak your authentic feelings instead of saying what you think others want to hear. It happens in the moment when you allow yourself to feel excited about a possibility instead of immediately focusing on what could go wrong. It happens in the decision to pursue an opportunity that calls to your soul, even though your familiar demon is screaming warnings about all the ways it could lead to disaster. These moments of choice are where the archetypal and the personal intersect, where the grand narrative of human evolution meets the intimate reality of individual experience. Each conscious choice you make ripples outward, contributing to the collective healing of patterns that have limited human potential for generations. But the ripple effects extend beyond the collective to encompass what we might call the intergenerational dimension of healing. The patterns of self-sabotage that you carry are not just personal acquisitions, but inherited legacies passed down through family lines, cultural traditions, and ancestral memories that live in your cells and shape your responses to life. When you choose to work consciously with these patterns, when you refuse to simply pass them on unconsciously to the next generation, you are engaging in what depth psychology calls ancestral healing. You are breaking cycles that may have been running in your family line for generations, creating new possibilities not just for yourself, but for your descendants, both biological and spiritual. This ancestral dimension adds another layer of meaning to the work of overcoming self-sabotage. You are not just healing for yourself, but for all those who came before you, who never had the opportunity to face their familiar demons consciously, and for all those who will come after you, who will inherit the fruits of your conscious work, rather than the unconscious patterns of limitation. The familiar demon, when understood in this context, begins to reveal itself as a keeper of ancestral memory, a repository of survival strategies that were developed by your predecessors in response to genuine threats and dangers. Its resistance to your happiness is not just personal protection, but ancestral wisdom about the costs that joy has historically extracted from your lineage. But this ancestral wisdom, like all wisdom, must be updated to remain relevant. The dangers that your ancestors faced may not be the dangers you face. The strategies that ensured their survival may not be the strategies that will ensure your flourishing. The familiar demon's ancestral memories need to be honored for their historical accuracy while being questioned for their contemporary relevance. This process of ancestral dialogue requires developing what we might call intergenerational discernment, the capacity to distinguish between ancestral wisdom that remains relevant and ancestral patterns that have outlived their usefulness. It involves learning to honor the struggles of your predecessors while refusing to be limited by their solutions. You can acknowledge that your grandmother's fear of standing out served her well in a context where visibility meant danger, while recognizing that your current context may reward rather than punish authentic self-expression. You can appreciate that your grandfather's strategy of emotional numbing protected him from overwhelming pain while choosing to develop your own capacity to feel without being overwhelmed. This intergenerational healing work often involves what we might call ancestral forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that excuses harmful behavior, but the kind that recognizes the impossible circumstances under which your ancestors made their choices, the limited options available to them, the genuine love that motivated even their most damaging protective strategies. When you can forgive your ancestors for passing on patterns of limitation, when you can see their struggles with compassion rather than judgment, something profound shifts in your relationship to your own familiar demon. The voice that has been criticizing you for your resistance to happiness begins to sound different, less harsh, more understanding of the legitimate fears that underlie the resistance. This softening creates space for a new kind of dialogue, one that honors both your longing for happiness and your inheritance of ancestral caution. Instead of waging war against your protective mechanisms, you begin to collaborate with them in finding new ways to ensure safety while allowing expansion. The familiar demon begins to evolve from a crude guardian into a sophisticated advisor, one that can help you navigate the genuine complexities of creating sustainable happiness in a world that still contains real dangers, real losses, real reasons for caution. It learns to distinguish between authentic threats and projected fears, between necessary protection and unnecessary limitation. This evolution is not a one-time transformation, but an ongoing process of refinement, a continuous dance between your expanding capacity for joy and your developing wisdom about how to protect that joy without destroying it. The familiar demon becomes your partner in this dance rather than your opponent, your collaborator in the delicate work of remaining open while staying grounded, vulnerable, while maintaining appropriate boundaries. As this partnership develops, as you learn to work with rather than against your own protective mechanisms, you begin to discover what we might call integrated happiness. Joy that includes rather than excludes your shadows, fulfillment that encompasses rather than transcends your limitations, peace that emerges from wholeness rather than from the absence of conflict. This integrated happiness is not the fragile conditional joy that depends on everything going according to plan. It is robust and resilient, capable of weathering storms because it is rooted not in external circumstances, but in your own capacity to remain connected to what matters most, regardless of what life brings. It is happiness that can coexist with sorrow, success that can include failure, love that can hold loss. It emerges not from the elimination of difficulty, but from the development of your capacity to find meaning and connection and aliveness even in the midst of challenge. This is the happiness that the familiar demon, in its deepest wisdom, has always been trying to protect. Not the shallow pleasure that comes and goes with circumstances, but the profound satisfaction that emerges from living in alignment with your deepest truth, your most authentic values, your genuine purpose. When you finally understand this, when you recognize that your resistance to happiness has always been motivated by love rather than hatred, by protection rather than destruction, by wisdom rather than foolishness, everything changes. The familiar demon is no longer your enemy, but your teacher. No longer your limitation, but your guide to sustainable fulfillment. And in this recognition, in this fundamental shift, in your relationship to your own complexity, you discover that the happiness you have been seeking was never separate from you. It was always present, always available, always waiting beneath the layers of protection that you developed to keep yourself safe in a world that seemed too dangerous for joy. The work of overcoming self-sabotage reveals itself to be not about acquiring something new, but about removing the obstacles to what has always been there. Not about becoming someone else, but about returning to who you have always been beneath the armor of limitation. Not about transcending your humanity, but about embracing it so fully that joy becomes as natural as breathing. This is the great secret that the familiar demon has been guarding all along. Not that happiness is dangerous, but that it is so precious, so sacred, so essential to your nature, that it must be protected from anything that would diminish or destroy it. The demon's resistance was never to your joy, but to the counterfeits that masquerade as joy while actually leading you away from your true nature. When you learn to recognize this distinction, when you develop the discernment to choose authentic happiness over its substitutes, the familiar demon becomes your greatest ally in the ongoing adventure of living fully, loving deeply, and contributing your unique gifts to the healing of a world that desperately needs what you have to offer. But this contribution cannot be forced or manufactured. It emerges naturally from the overflow of your own genuine fulfillment, the spontaneous expression of a life lived in alignment with truth. When you are no longer spending your energy fighting against your own nature, when you are no longer exhausting yourself through self-sabotage, tremendous creative force becomes available for serving something larger than your personal satisfaction. This service is not sacrifice but celebration, not duty but delight, not obligation but opportunity. It flows from abundance rather than depletion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from the irrepressible urge to share what has been freely given rather than from the compulsive need to prove your worth through endless giving. This service that emerges from integrated happiness carries a particular quality that distinguishes it from the compulsive helping that so many engage in as a way of avoiding their own inner work. It is service that comes from presence rather than performance, from being rather than doing, from the simple fact of your existence as a fully realized human being rather than from any specific actions you might take. When you are no longer betraying yourself in service of others' comfort, when you are no longer abandoning your truth to maintain connections that require your diminishment, you become a different kind of healing presence in the world. Not the kind that fixes or rescues or saves, but the kind that simply demonstrates what is possible when a human being chooses to live from their essential nature rather than from their protective programming. This demonstration happens not through preaching or teaching or any form of evangelism for happiness, but through the quiet revolution of a life lived with integrity. Others sense something different about you, something that cannot be explained through conventional categories. There is a quality of aliveness, of groundedness, of authentic presence that speaks to something deep within them, their own buried longing for the same kind of integration you have achieved. But this influence is entirely indirect, entirely without agenda. You are not trying to change anyone or convince anyone of anything. You are simply being yourself, fully and authentically, and that being becomes a kind of permission for others to explore their own possibilities for wholeness. The familiar demon, now evolved into its role as discriminating advisor, helps you navigate the complexities of this influence. It warns you against the subtle pride that can arise from becoming a catalyst for others' growth, the spiritual ego that can develop when you begin to see the positive impact of your own transformation. It helps you remain humble, grounded, aware that your healing is ongoing rather than complete, that your integration is a process rather than an achievement. This humility is essential because the journey toward authentic happiness is not a linear progression from darkness to light, from limitation to freedom, from suffering to joy. It is a spiral dance, a continuous movement between expansion and contraction, integration and disintegration, clarity and confusion. Even after years of conscious work with self-sabotage, the familiar demon can still be activated by new challenges, unexpected losses, unfamiliar territories of growth. But your relationship to these activations changes fundamentally. Instead of being overwhelmed by the return of old patterns, you recognize them as information. Instead of interpreting resistance as evidence of failure, you understand it as a sign that you are approaching new edges of expansion. Instead of being paralyzed by the familiar demon's warnings, you engage in conscious dialogue about what needs attention, what requires protection, what deserves careful consideration. This mature relationship with your own complexity allows for what we might call sustainable transformation. Change that honors both your need for growth and your need for stability, both your longing for expansion and your requirement for safety. You learn to move at a pace that challenges without overwhelming, to take risks that stretch without breaking, to remain open while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The happiness that emerges from this sustainable approach is not the manic euphoria of spiritual highs or the fragile elation of temporary successes. It is the deep contentment that comes from living in right relationship with yourself, the quiet satisfaction that emerges from making choices aligned with your deepest values, the abiding peace that flows from accepting both your light and your shadow as essential aspects of your wholeness. This happiness does not eliminate the reality of loss, disappointment, grief, or challenge. Instead, it provides a stable foundation from which to meet these inevitable aspects of human experience without being destroyed by them. You learn to grieve without being consumed by despair, to face setbacks without abandoning hope, to encounter difficulties without losing connection to what gives your life meaning. The familiar demon, in its evolved form, becomes invaluable in navigating these challenges. It helps you distinguish between appropriate sadness and destructive depression, between healthy caution and paralyzing fear, between necessary solitude and isolating withdrawal. It offers the wisdom of experience without the tyranny of past conditioning, the intelligence of protection without the limitation of excessive defensiveness. But perhaps most importantly, this evolved relationship with your own protective mechanisms creates space for what we might call authentic spontaneity, the capacity to respond to life from presence rather than pattern, from awareness rather than automation, from love rather than fear. When you are no longer spending enormous amounts of energy managing your own self-sabotage, when you are no longer exhausting yourself through internal conflict, tremendous creative force becomes available for engaging with life in fresh, innovative, genuinely responsive ways. This spontaneity is not the impulsive reactivity of unintegrated emotion, but the fluid responsiveness of integrated awareness. It emerges from a deep trust in your own essential nature, a confidence that when you are truly present, when you are fully yourself, your responses will naturally align with what serves the highest good of all concerned. Such trust cannot be manufactured through positive thinking or spiritual practices alone. It must be earned through the patient work of proving to yourself over and over again that you can be trusted with your own life. Each time you honor your intuition despite your fear, each time you speak your truth despite potential consequences, each time you choose love, despite your conditioning toward protection, you build the evidence base that supports genuine self-trust. This self-trust becomes the foundation for what we might call fearless intimacy, the capacity to be fully present with others without losing yourself, to love deeply without becoming dependent, to offer your gifts without attachment to how they are received. The familiar demon, now serving as wise counselor rather than anxious guardian, helps you navigate the subtle territories of this kind of intimacy. It helps you recognize when you are giving from fullness versus giving from emptiness, when you are connecting from authenticity versus connecting from need, when you are loving from choice versus loving from compulsion. It offers the discernment that allows you to remain open-hearted while maintaining appropriate boundaries, vulnerable while preserving your essential integrity. This fearless intimacy extends beyond personal relationships to encompass your relationship with life itself. You begin to approach existence with the same quality of presence that you have learned to bring to human connection, fully engaged but not attached, deeply caring but not controlling, committed but not rigid in your expectations of how things should unfold. The familiar demon helps you navigate this larger intimacy with life by distinguishing between surrender and passivity, between acceptance and resignation, between trust and naivety. It helps you remain actively engaged with shaping your experience while releasing attachment to outcomes beyond your control. In this dance between engagement and surrender, between effort and allowing, between doing and being, you discover what the mystics have called the middle way, a path that avoids both the extreme of frantic striving and the extreme of passive withdrawal. You learn to work with life rather than against it, to collaborate with the larger forces that shape existence rather than exhausting yourself through futile attempts to control what cannot be controlled. This collaboration requires developing what we might call cosmic perspective, the capacity to see your individual life within the larger context of existence itself, to recognize your personal struggles as part of the universal human journey toward consciousness, to understand your specific challenges as expressions of archetypal patterns that have been working themselves out through countless individual lives across millennia. From this cosmic perspective, your familiar demon reveals itself to be not just a personal protective mechanism, but a manifestation of the larger intelligence that governs all existence. The same force that causes flowers to close their petals at night, that teaches animals to hibernate in winter, that ensures that all systems have built-in mechanisms for self-preservation and survival. This recognition transforms your relationship to resistance from one of opposition to one of collaboration. You begin to see the familiar demon's protective impulses as expressions of the same cosmic intelligence that keeps planets in their orbits, that maintains the delicate balance of ecosystems, that orchestrates the intricate dance of creation and destruction that characterizes all natural processes. When you align yourself with this larger intelligence rather than fighting against it, when you learn to work with the natural rhythms of expansion and contraction Rather than trying to force constant growth, something profound shifts in your experience of being alive. The struggle that has characterized so much of your relationship with yourself begins to soften into a more fluid, organic process of unfolding. This organic unfolding cannot be rushed or forced. It has its own timing, its own seasons, its own natural progression that must be respected if it is to reach full fruition. The familiar demon, now serving as your connection to this larger timing, helps you recognize when to push forward and when to rest, when to take action and when to wait, when to engage and when to withdraw. This attunement to natural timing requires developing what we might call somatic wisdom, the capacity to read the subtle signals of your own nervous system, to recognize the difference between resistance that indicates you are moving too fast and resistance that indicates you are approaching something important, to distinguish between the contraction that comes from fear and the contraction that comes from natural rest. Your body becomes your ally in this work, offering constantly updated information about your current capacity for expansion, your need for integration, your readiness for new challenges. The familiar demon learns to speak through these somatic signals rather than through the harsh voice of cognitive criticism, offering its protective wisdom through the language of sensation rather than the tyranny of fearful thoughts. As you develop fluency in this somatic language, as you learn to trust the intelligence of your own nervous system, you discover that your body has always been trying to guide you towards sustainable happiness. The tension that arises when you betray your truth, the exhaustion that follows periods of inauthentic performance, the aliveness that emerges when you align with your deepest values, all of these are forms of guidance, information from your own wisdom about what serves your highest good. The familiar demon, when filtered through somatic awareness, becomes a sophisticated feedback system that helps you navigate the complexities of modern life while remaining true to your essential nature. It helps you recognize when you are pushing beyond your current capacity, when you are settling for less than what you truly want, when you are moving in directions that serve your ego but not your soul. This somatic attunement also helps you recognize the difference between authentic happiness and its counterfeits. True joy has a particular quality in the body. It feels expansive but grounded, energizing but peaceful, exciting but sustainable. False happiness, by contrast, often carries an undertone of anxiety, a sense of needing to maintain or protect the good feeling, a quality of fragility that suggests it could be lost at any moment. The familiar demon, when working in harmony with your somatic intelligence, becomes expert at recognizing these subtle differences. It learns to celebrate authentic joy while maintaining healthy skepticism about experiences that promise happiness but deliver only temporary pleasure followed by inevitable crash. This discrimination becomes essential as you move deeper into the territory of sustainable fulfillment. The world is full of experiences that offer the appearance of happiness while actually feeding the very patterns of self-sabotage you are working to transform. Consumerism promises satisfaction through acquisition. Social media offers connection while delivering isolation. Spiritual materialism suggests enlightenment through the accumulation of experiences and insights. All of these counterfeits can temporarily satisfy your longing for happiness while actually moving you further from the authentic fulfillment that comes from living in alignment with your deepest truth. The familiar demon, now serving as your discriminating wisdom, helps you recognize these false promises before you invest too much energy in pursuing them. But this discrimination must be balanced with openness to genuine opportunities for growth and expansion. The same protective mechanism that guards against false promises can also prevent you from recognizing authentic invitations to greater fulfillment. Learning to distinguish between appropriate caution and excessive protection requires ongoing dialogue between your expanding consciousness and your evolved defensive structures. This dialogue becomes a lifelong practice, a continuous conversation between different aspects of yourself that allows for both safety and growth, both protection and expansion, both wisdom and wonder. The familiar demon learns to serve not as a barrier to experience, but as a filter that helps you choose experiences that genuinely serve your evolution rather than simply providing temporary distraction from your deeper longings. As this filtering system becomes more sophisticated, as you develop greater discernment about what truly serves your happiness, you begin to live with what we might call effortless effort, a quality of engagement that is simultaneously relaxed and focused, casual and committed, playful and purposeful. This effortless effort emerges when you are no longer fighting against your own nature, when your conscious intentions align with your unconscious programming, when your familiar demon becomes your ally rather than your adversary in the pursuit of authentic fulfillment. Action flows from being rather than being forced by doing. Choices emerge from clarity rather than being driven by compulsion. The happiness that characterizes this way of living is not dependent on external circumstances, but emerges from the harmony between different aspects of yourself. It is the satisfaction that comes from living as a unified being rather than as a collection of conflicting parts, the peace that flows from internal alignment rather than from the absence of challenge. This internal alignment creates what we might call magnetic authenticity, a quality of presence that naturally attracts people and opportunities that resonate with your true nature, while naturally repelling those that would require you to betray your essential self. You no longer need to work so hard to create the life you want, because your very being becomes an organizing principle that draws to you what belongs in your experience. The familiar demon, now serving as your authenticity detector, helps you recognize when you are moving toward or away from this magnetic alignment. It alerts you when you are compromising your truth for acceptance, when you are performing a version of yourself that feels foreign, when you are pursuing goals that belong to someone else's vision of success rather than your own. This authenticity detector becomes increasingly sensitive as you practice living from your essential nature. What once felt like acceptable compromises begin to feel intolerable. Relationships that once seemed adequate begin to feel suffocating. Work that once provided security begins to feel soul-crushing. This is not regression but evolution. Your capacity to tolerate inauthenticity diminishes as your commitment to truth deepens. But this evolution can be disorienting, even frightening. The familiar demon may activate in response to the disruption of familiar patterns, even when those patterns were limiting your potential for happiness. It may interpret the discomfort of growth as evidence of danger, the uncertainty of transformation as reason to retreat to known limitations. This is where the ongoing dialogue between your expanding consciousness and your protective mechanisms becomes crucial. You must help the familiar demon understand that some discomfort is not only acceptable but necessary for authentic transformation, that some uncertainty, is the natural result of moving beyond the boundaries of your previous experience. You must teach your protective systems to distinguish between the discomfort of growth and the discomfort of genuine threat, between the uncertainty of expansion and the uncertainty of actual danger. This teaching happens not through rational argument, but through embodied experience, by moving carefully through the discomfort while demonstrating that you can remain safe, by embracing uncertainty while maintaining connection to your essential self. Each successful navigation of growth-related discomfort strengthens your capacity for transformation. Each experience of moving through uncertainty while remaining grounded builds your tolerance for the unknown. Each moment of choosing authenticity despite fear expands your definition of what is possible in your life. This expansion of possibility is perhaps the greatest gift that comes from working consciously with self-sabotage. When you are no longer limited by unconscious patterns of protection, when you are no longer bound by inherited definitions of what is safe or acceptable or available to someone like you, life becomes an open field of potential rather than a narrow corridor of predetermined options. The familiar demon, transformed from guard to guide, helps you navigate this field of potential with wisdom and discernment. It helps you recognize which possibilities genuinely align with your essential nature and which are simply projections of ego or fantasy. It helps you move toward opportunities that will genuinely fulfill you while avoiding those that would simply distract you from your deeper purpose. This deeper purpose begins to reveal itself as you live more authentically, as you make choices from your essential nature rather than from your conditioned patterns. It emerges not as a grand mission imposed from outside, but as the natural expression of who you are, when all the layers of protection and performance are stripped away. The familiar demon learns to recognize and support this emerging purpose, understanding that your deepest fulfillment comes not from avoiding all risk, but from taking the risks that align with your soul's calling. It learns to distinguish between reckless endangerment and courageous authenticity, between foolish disregard for consequences and wise commitment to what matters most. As this purpose clarifies and deepens, as you begin to live more fully from your essential nature, something remarkable happens. The question of whether you deserve happiness becomes irrelevant because happiness is no longer something you pursue, but something you embody. It is not a goal to be achieved, but a natural consequence of living in alignment with truth. The familiar demon, now serving as guardian of authenticity rather than enemy of joy, helps protect this alignment from the countless forces that would pull you back into patterns of inauthenticity. It helps you recognize when you are being invited to betray your truth for approval, when you are being tempted to abandon your path for security, when you are being seduced into performing a version of yourself that feels foreign to your essential nature. This protection of authenticity becomes the familiar demon's highest service. Not the crude protection of keeping you small and safe, but the sophisticated protection of keeping you true to yourself, even when such truth requires courage, even when it involves risk, even when it means disappointing others who preferred the smaller version of yourself. In this ultimate transformation, the familiar demon reveals its true nature, not as an enemy of your happiness, but as the guardian of your most precious treasure, your authentic self. Its resistance was never to your joy, but to anything that would compromise the integrity of who you truly are. Its sabotage was never meant to destroy your dreams, but to ensure that the dreams you pursue are truly your own rather than borrowed from others' expectations. When you finally understand this, when you recognize the love that has always motivated your familiar demon's protective interventions, everything changes. The internal war ends not through victory or defeat, but through recognition. The recognition that both your longing for happiness and your fear of it arise from the same source, the same love, the same commitment to your ultimate well-being. This recognition marks the beginning of what we might call integrated living, existence that includes rather than excludes your complexity, that honors rather than denies your shadows, that embraces rather than transcends your humanity. It is living that flows from wholeness rather than perfection, from authenticity rather than idealization, from love rather than fear. The happiness that emerges from such living is not the fragile joy that must be protected from all difficulty, but the robust contentment that can weather any storm because it is rooted in something deeper than circumstances. It is happiness that includes sorrow, success that encompasses failure, love that holds loss, peace that emerges from the full embrace of what it means to be gloriously, messily, beautifully human. And in this embrace, in this full acceptance of your own complexity, you discover that the happiness you have been seeking was never separate from you. It was always present, always available, always waiting to be recognized beneath the layers of protection that you developed to keep yourself safe in a world that seemed too dangerous for joy. The familiar demon, transformed from saboteur to sage, stands guard over this recognition, not to prevent others from seeing your happiness, but to ensure that you never again forget the precious truth of who you are beneath all the roles you play, all the masks you wear, all the strategies you employ to navigate the complexities of existence. This is the deepest healing, the ultimate integration, the final homecoming, not to a place but to yourself, not to a state but to your own essential nature, not to happiness as a destination, but to happiness as the very ground of your being, temporarily obscured but never truly lost, always available to be rediscovered in any moment when you choose to remember who you truly are. This homecoming is not a moment of arrival, but a way of inhabiting each breath, each choice, each interaction with the world. It requires no fanfare, demands no witnesses, needs no external validation. It simply asks that you show up fully to your own experience, that you meet each moment with the totality of who you are rather than the fragments of who you think you should be. The familiar demon, now your most trusted counselor, whispers not warnings of doom, but reminders of truth. When the world grows loud with its demands and expectations, when others project their unlived lives onto your choices, when the collective trance of limitation tries to reclaim you, it speaks. Remember who you are. Remember what you have learned. Remember that your happiness is not a betrayal of those who suffer, but a beacon for those who have forgotten their own capacity for joy. This remembering becomes a daily practice, a moment-by-moment choice to inhabit your authentic nature rather than your protective personas. Some days the choice feels effortless, natural as breathing. Other days it requires conscious effort, deliberate acts of courage to remain true to yourself when everything around you suggests that truth is dangerous, that authenticity is a luxury you cannot afford, that happiness is selfish in a world filled with pain. But here lies the final paradox, the ultimate mystery that can only be lived rather than understood. Your individual happiness is not separate from the healing of the collective human wound. When you refuse to sabotage your own joy, when you insist on living from your authentic nature despite all the forces that would keep you small, you participate in the larger awakening that our species desperately needs. Every moment you choose truth over comfort, every time you honor your genuine desires rather than performing what others expect, every instance of refusing to abandon yourself for acceptance, you weave another thread in the tapestry of human liberation. You demonstrate that transformation is possible, that the patterns of limitation that have been passed down through generations can be interrupted, that human beings can indeed learn to trust their own capacity for fulfillment. This is not grandiose thinking, but simple truth. The familiar demon, in its evolved wisdom, understands this interconnection. It no longer guards only your individual well-being, but serves the larger purpose of protecting the authentic expression that the world needs you to embody. It has learned that your happiness is not a personal indulgence, but a form of service, not a withdrawal from the world's pain, but a contribution to its healing. And so you live, breath by breath, choice by choice, in the ongoing dance between expansion and contraction, between courage and caution, between the part of you that reaches toward the light and the part that remembers the darkness. But now it is a conscious dance, a willing partnership between all aspects of yourself in service of something larger than any individual part could accomplish alone. The familiar demon takes its place in this dance, not as your opponent, but as your partner, not as your limitation, but as your wisdom, not as the enemy of your happiness, but as its most devoted guardian. Together, you move through the world not in perfect harmony, for that would be a kind of death, but in conscious collaboration, each step informed by both your longing for joy and your commitment to truth. This is the completion that is never complete, the arrival that is always arriving, the happiness that reveals itself to be not a destination, but the very ground upon which you walk, not a prize to be won, but the essence of who you have always been, waiting patiently beneath every layer of protection to be recognized, celebrated, and finally fearlessly lived.